Thank you, Ty. So, welcome this afternoon. Please. A warning before we get started. Listening or participating in this conversation may result in thinking that it is not recognized or accepted by the vast majority of the population. I just want to kind of get that out there before we get started. Side effects may include a fascination with abstract concepts, an increase in the level of dissatisfaction with existing processes and or procedures, daydreaming, prototyping, and I think in my case, most certainly, not particularly being encouraged to share what I've learned in certain circles outside of the innovation community, which may or may not result in your being invited to social functions and or dinner parties. So be warned as we start to get into some of these topics. If you want to share them, just do that at your own discretion. Before we get started, I did want to mention, so I've recently relocated to Dallas, thankfully, from a much colder climate. So I'm really enjoying it right now. And throughout all the different places I've lived, I keep this sort of footlocker of memorabilia. And I recently rediscovered this, and one of the things that I discovered, believe it or not, you'll see exactly how old I am right now, but when I went on spring break in 1993 to Myrtle Beach with my friends in college, and I had a shoebox of some of these memories, and within the shoebox, and I'm not even kidding, were these items. And I look back on this and just thinking how far we've come in the past 20 odd years in terms of, I don't know if folks remember the triptych where you would physically go to, let's say, AAA, and a person would take a map and a highlighter and actually show you the route that you would be taking, right? The thought of doing that today is absurd. I had a traveler's check. I think my grandma gave me a disposable camera. Think about that. You had a camera, you would take pictures, and then you would take it to a lab, and then if you were lucky, you get those pictures back in an hour. If not, you get them a few days later, right? Or, and my personal favorite is the mixtape, which was absolutely essential for your 12-hour drive. But I was just thinking the other day, I was going to the gym, and it's like, I want to make a new playlist. It took me probably a minute and a half, and I have access to every song that's possibly, ever been recorded, right, in the library that I have access to. And the reason I'm mentioning this is, I think that a lot of times, historically, we've taken this technology for granted. It just sort of enters our lives, and if you reflect upon sort of the things that I'm mentioning, is like I got in the car this morning, I typed the address in my phone, I had navigation, I had Bluetooth, I'm listening to music. It's such a different world than the world I was living in not so long ago. And I think that this is something that is important for us to reflect on, just in terms of how much our lives have changed in the past 20 years, in the past 5 years. Think back to the phone that you may have had even this time last year. The phone I have now is it's light years ahead of the phone I had a year and a half ago, and the things that I'm able to do with it. So next slide, please. So we're going to get into a few topics, and I think you'll start to hear more of this. It's starting to pop up more in industry, but the first point that I really want to raise is it's a concept, and if you remember anything we talk about today, please remember this, and it's a concept known as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So what the Fourth Industrial Revolution essentially is, what they're saying is that there were three revolutions that preceded the fourth, the first with using water and steam, the second using electric power, the third using electronics and information technology. But the Fourth Industrial Revolution is building upon the third, and it's characterized by this fusion of technologies that's blurring the lines between the physical, digital, and biological spheres. And if you think about that, as we get back to my previous example, it really is this sort of symbiotic relationship that we have with our technology, right? So a quick example is I went mountain biking last weekend, and I've got my watch, I've got my phone, I know exactly how fast I'm going, I know what my route is, I know the barometric pressure, I know the altitude, I'm listening to music, I know my heart rate, I know how many calories I've burned, right? And this is just going on a very simple bike trip, right? It's also tracking me, so in the event that I go left instead of right and I find myself in a canyon and the EMTs have to come find me, they can do that also. But it's how we are starting to essentially merge with this technology. And I think the other piece of this that is essential for us to recognize is the speed of the technological breakthroughs has no historical precedent. We are moving at such a fast rate that we've never experienced this in human history. And the other piece of this is that it's disrupting almost every industry in every country. And we're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about the ripple effects of the introduction of technology across multiple industries. There is a scary stat that basically says analysts predict 50% of the S&P 500 will be replaced over the course of the next 10 years. But I think it's the very simple case of you're either paying attention or you're not. Right? And if you're a business, you need to be paying attention because the rate of change is happening so quickly. And these things where you have analysts that are saying this is a technology that's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I can assure you that curve is getting accelerated each and every day. Right? It's my job essentially to talk to startups in emerging tech on a daily basis. And once again, if I dare to share some of the things that I've learned, people think that I'm completely making it up. It sounds like complete science fiction, and yet I've actually seen working code. I've seen these things in action. It just hasn't reached a level of adoption yet that has gone mainstream. But it's absolutely real, and if you're not dialed into this and you don't have awareness in terms of what's coming, you are going to be caught unaware. The second topic that I want to bring up, which I think is particularly interesting, is something called the imagination age. And a stat that I really love is by the World Economic Forum that reveals that almost 65% of the jobs elementary school students will be doing in the future do not exist today. So think about that for a second. With half of the companies in the S&P 500 disappearing in the next 10 years, and this large percentage of jobs and occupations that don't even exist yet, right? So what we start looking at, whether it's the fourth industrial revolution or the imagination age, it's very interesting in that what this theory suggests is that with things like AI and robotics and a lot of the, I'm going to say the mundane tasks that human beings perform or computational tasks, they are going to be taken, or machines will be given the responsibility to actually conduct these tasks. So where do human beings fit in? And where human beings fit in is its imagination. Now I know this sounds sort of like very Jim Henson Muppetish, but really what this means is that it's creativity, and it's creativity through things like the creation of content. So you can think of platforms like YouTube. You can think of immersive experiences in virtual reality. It's what the human mind essentially can conceive, and this is going to essentially drive many aspects of economy moving forward. So if you're thinking about then with this rapid pace of innovation, and then the need, or essentially for the creation of content and creativity and imagination, and really the creation of new experiences, and I'm going to stress the word experiences throughout our talk today. Another, I think, very essential concept for people in the innovation space, or people who are thinking about innovation, they need to sort of think about, right? Because we're moving beyond simply data analytics, automation, and we're moving into a brand new world of experiences that have yet to be realized. Just so you know the source, Rita J. King actually coined this phrase. So if you would like to get some more information in terms of where this is coming from, but essentially what I love that she says is that we can collectively imagine and create the future we want to inhabit before we lose that chance. But the reason I included this slide in the deck is because we do have this opportunity. And it is through the creation of these experiences that will drive this new economy. And if essentially you want to be part of that solution, you want to be part of that equation, but it's not as easy as it sounds. So generally when I've given this talk, or a similar talk, I can look into the audience and I see a little bit of sweat. beating on people's foreheads. They're like, you know what, we're not a particularly innovative company. We've been doing the same thing for the last 20, 30, 50 years. You know what we're going to do? We're going to ride this out. Because, how bad can it actually be? He's talking about the imagination age and the fourth industrial revolution, and I heard this 20 years ago, and guess what? We're still here. So you know what? We're just going to kind of just let this go. Which reminds me of this quote. It's one of my favorite quotes, and I think if you remove the word rabbit and substitute the word disruption, it becomes a bit more powerful. Essentially is, hello disruption, is that you? Let's pretend it isn't, said disruption, and see what happens. So essentially at this point, you're gambling with your future and the future of your organization. As you look through, let's say the last 20 years, and we have, there are actually 2 slides with quotes, but I'd love to come back and look and see quotes made by the leaders of businesses, essentially looking at some emerging technology and dismissing it. So things like there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home, Apple is already dead, and I love this one. Who listens to 1,000 songs? When they were talking about the Nano. And how about this one? Neither Redbox or Netflix are even on the radar screen in terms of competition. Former Blockbuster CEO of Blockbuster, right? But I mean, if you think about it, and I'm old enough to remember, on a Friday night, everyone drove to Blockbuster. They may or may not have the movie. You got charged late fees if you actually had VHS, if you didn't rewind it. And I remember being in an airport in San Jose and actually seeing flyers from this thing called Netflix. And they were mailing essentially the CDs or the DVDs to your house. I thought, this is awesome. But the fact that it didn't register in terms of a threat to the established sort of business model, we look back on that now and think that's completely absurd. But at the time, they chose to essentially ignore what was going on in the marketplace. Which lends us to this slide, which essentially is, you can ask yourself, would you like to be on the left side of this slide or the right-hand side? And if you look at some of these different, and we'll get into this in a bit, is the slides, or rather the companies and the logos on the right, really had some very disruptive business models, right? I mean, think about something like Uber, where, I mean, how many people are familiar with the medallions in New York City for cab drivers, right? And how many, what is it, like $1 million to have a medallion to drive a cab? And I remember being in New York City and I was with some friends, we were talking about, well, maybe you could have fractional ownership of medallions, or you could do these things. And all of a sudden, someone came along and just basically said, we're just going to do it completely differently. We're not even going to play the medallion game. And, or Airbnb, right, who actually doesn't own any property, right? And yet, I think last New Year's Eve, rented out more, had more real estate than all of the different hotel chains combined, which is amazing because it was a very different model, a very different lens that they were looking through. And we'll get into that in a second in terms of how do you do that. So now also when I've been giving this is typically the other response that I'll get, or I'll see in the audience, are people that are suddenly getting out their phones and texting someone saying, I'm at this event and this guy on stage is basically scaring the pants off of me. So what we need to do is we need to get an innovation center and an innovation lead right now. However, this is kind of an innovation joke, is what's the difference between an innovation center and a museum? People actually go to museums, right? I mean, how many places have you been, and I've been in quite a few, where a company says, all right, innovation lead, check. Innovation center, I don't care what it costs, get it. And they're beautiful, right? They're beautiful spaces, but they are museums, because I've walked in and it's like, wow, this is pretty much amazing. This is amazing, but what goes on here? All right, innovation, I'm like, there are no human beings in this room. There's nothing going on here. I'm like, well, we're working on that. But we got the building when we're ready. It's like, good plan, that sounds great. So, when you look at innovation, why is it so difficult? And a lot of organizations look at innovation, they want to have an innovation program, they want to be innovative, and yet they fail. And in many cases, they fail miserably. So why is that? I'm going to give you two concepts that I hope will help, something else to sort of put in your back pocket. The first is something called the innovation paradox. And what the innovation paradox maintains is that the more that you invest in innovation, the less likely you are to succeed. That sounds really counterintuitive, doesn't it? You would think, like anything else, the more I invest, the more likely I am to succeed. And the reason being is you can't treat your innovation projects like you treat everything else, right? There's a reason why a lot of innovation centers use the metaphor of a rainforest or a conservatory or a greenhouse. And the reason being is, imagine the traditional corporate structure is like a farm. And on this farm, you plant corn. Anything that grows that's not corn is a weed. And that weed is removed, right? But within an innovation function, what you need to be able to do is to create an environment where you're allowed to experiment and you are not constrained essentially by the same rules that you've applied to the rest of your business, right? So whether it's Six Sigma or whether it's PMI or PMP, and what's kind of funny is that a lot of people that are starting their new innovation programs, it's like, well, what's your first order of business? Well, we need governance, and we need a charter, and we need to, form 10 different committees and get a team and have roles and responsibilities. And it's like, okay, and that's how you manage every other project, right? It's like, absolutely. It's like, okay, well, if you do that, then what you're going to do is you're essentially going to squash any creativity, any imagination, and people are going to be afraid to fail. And therefore, you're not going to make any progress. So I think this is quite an interesting concept, and we could go into this. We could actually spend a lot of time on this in terms of how to create a culture of innovation. But I think the takeaway from this is that you need to create an environment sort of outside of the mothership where people have the freedom to experiment and to do research that is sort of atypical from maybe the policies, practices, and procedures that you have in place for the rest of your organization. The other theory that I wanted to share with you is something called the law of diffusion of innovation. And essentially what this bell curve suggests is how products go from ideation to the marketplace and how they actually gain acceptance. And there's this something called the tipping point, which is around 16%, which basically says that once you get greater than 16% market penetration, then you actually start to see sort of the return on your investment. Which is great from a product marketing perspective, it's great from a product development perspective, but one of the things we're going to get into right now, or two things, is what drives this adoption? What are the factors that actually make people want to buy your product? So it's not enough to have an innovative product that has all of the features and functions that you think that someone else might need. It's what are those other sort of elements associated with your company and your product that drive adoption. The other piece of this that I want to bring to your attention is stuff is happening here, right? It's happening with the innovators and the 2.5%. You might not see it until it reaches 16%, and I would argue by the time you see it, it's too late, given the rate of change that we're experiencing, right? And I think a good example is there's a statistic that essentially says that your top 3 applications on your phone you spend 70% of your time using 3 apps on your phone, right? So how hard is it to break into the top 3? And the other piece of this is once you make it into the top 3, how do you stay in the top 3? You have to stay relevant, right? So it's this constant battle to stay relevant and to provide experiences that people find valuable. So, now that sure. I'm sorry? The top 3. Oh, no, it's by person. So for example, on your phone, on all of our phones, there are 3 apps that we go to over and over again. And that changes, that's different for every single person. I'm sure that we probably have a lot of the same shared apps. But if you think about it, if you look at like the App Store or something, the number of applications in that ecosystem, right? I'm going to guess there are probably like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of applications that you could download right now, but you've got 3 that you're using. So how do you even break through to, let's say someone like yourself, if there's a new app, it could be the best app on the planet, how do I make you aware of it and actually get you to use it, right? And these are questions that we have to ask when we're bringing a new product to market or a new innovation to market. So getting into what I'm calling the keys to innovation, and the first piece of this is something called technology scouting. And with technology scouting, this is also very important, but I look at this through the lens of capability. I think that you have to have awareness of what's going on in the world. And in order to have awareness of what's going on in the world, you'll see this a lot in the literature too, get out of the building, right? You can't be aware of what's going on in the world by sitting in your chair, right? You have to connect with people, you have to connect with other organizations, and it's through these connections that you establish networks, and then one conversation leads to another conversation. And it's through this scouting that you become aware of what is emerging, what exists. I'm particularly fond of working with universities. I think that moving forward, I mean, universities have always been essential, but I think now universities are driving the vast majority of innovation, particularly in emerging technology, and from a number of different disciplines. So if we go to the next slide, please. One thing you need to avoid is something called shiny new toy syndrome. And what shiny new toy syndrome is, essentially, is it's finding a technology and then saying, we need to find something to do with this. This is awesome, right? I'll give you an example. If you hop on LinkedIn, if you go on TechCrunch or something, and everyone seems to be obsessed with the moment with, let's say, blockchain, right? So you don't know how many conversations I've had with people where it's like, blockchain, we need to do something with blockchain. And my answer is why? What problem are you trying to solve? So we just need to do something with it because it's the future and it's cool. It's like, no. What you need to do is you need to be aware of the capabilities and the limitations blockchain or whatever technology happens to exist. And I refer to something as, I call it a technology arsenal, but you can think of it as a shelf in your mind, right? Or a shelf in an Excel spreadsheet where essentially is you have this inventory of technology and you are aware of its capabilities and you are aware of its limitations. And this is going to become very important later, but resist the temptation to look at a technology as a shiny new toy and then try to find an area of your business where you can implement this new technology, right? Because I don't think you're going to be particularly successful. And time again, I can't tell you how many different conversations I've been part of where, I've heard that people are locked in a room for 8 hours and it's like, we're going to come up with use cases for this. Right? And then at the end of the day, it's not particularly productive, everyone's frustrated, and they're not particularly fond of the technology anymore, as opposed to just understanding what the capabilities are and the limitations of the limitations of the technology. So, I am moderately obsessed with this topic, just be forewarned. Digital ethnography. Digital ethnography is the study of the effects of technology on human behavior and how, essentially, the rate of adoption of a particular technology based on human behavior. Why this is important is if you go back to my previous example in terms of the shoebox that I found from spring break, right? It's like the introduction of new technology has changed how I behave as a human being. And if we look at this, then we can also say then how are patterns of behavior shaping the adoption of technology? And this all, once again, gets back to the experience that is being created, right? Underline the word experience, write it in bold, circle it. It's about the experience that's being created. And I'll take you through an ethnographic exercise. This is, so at any point, just stop me if this becomes mind-numbingly boring. But you could start with any technology, So let's just start with autonomous vehicles. And you could say, okay, what impact will autonomous vehicles have across industries? So, and I was just at the University of Michigan 2 weeks ago, and they have a fully autonomous bus that picks up students and drops them off in a 2-mile loop. It's really pretty cool, right? So autonomous vehicles exist. So if we start thinking about, okay, well, what does the introduction of an autonomous vehicle, what impact would that have on an industry? And you could start to speculate, and these are exercises that we actually do. It's like, okay, well, what about the insurance industry? If I'm not driving, do I have to carry as much insurance as an owner? So maybe that's one of the things where you start to, like, you literally draw a circle of autonomous vehicles with a line that says disruption, insurance industry. And then we start saying, okay, well, what if we sprinkle a little bit of Tesla on this? And now this autonomous vehicle is no longer using gasoline, but it's using electricity. So what does that mean to the oil and gas industry? What does that mean to, am I going to need gas stations on every corner, or am I going to need charging stations? Okay, now let's go and let's sprinkle a little bit of Uber on this, or Lyft. So now I've got a fully autonomous electric vehicle that will bring me things, right? So now, do I need to buy a car? Right? If 90% of my car's life is parked in its driveway, then do I need to buy a car? Do I need to go anywhere? Right? And then another example, and I'm sorry if anyone's a franchise owner, but I was going through a restaurant and there was a sticker that said Uber Eats. And I know that this particular location, this franchise, probably cost that owner a few $1,000,000. Well, with Uber Eats, guess what? I could make the same food in a warehouse and you'd never know it, as long as it comes in the same packaging that arrives on your doorstep. So do I need that physical location anymore? Probably not, right? And you can continue to kind of go down this path, and in this particular example, we're saying that people don't need to go anywhere they don't want to go, and want is the most important piece of this. So where will people want to go, and why? And how can we connect with people if they physically aren't going to locations? So this is, I think, when you start looking through this ethnographic lens, you're not trying to solve a problem in as much as you're making observations about the introduction of technology and the subsequent impact on human behavior. So I know we're sort of dabbling in futurism, but I would say the difference between this and what people would call futurism is you are making predictions, and then you're able to measure the accuracy of your predictions, and then you can also adjust them as necessary. So let's say that and you can also tie them to time frames. So it's like, okay, well, autonomous is here, but we go back to sprinkle a little bit of Tesla. I don't know how realistic that is. And then if Elon Musk announced, well, guess what? I'm going to double production next year, and I'm going to make these things $35,000 instead of $70,000. Okay, that's game changing, right? We're going to adjust our prediction. But it's starting to look through this lens that, particularly if you have a business and you are dependent upon people physically coming to your stores, and it's like, oh, they won't have to do that. So what do we do? Or what experiences do we create in the stores, or how do we engage them outside of this brick and mortar establishment? The third piece is understanding your why. There are 2 videos that I watch over and over and over. It's quite sad, but I enjoy them, so give me that. The first is Steve Jobs when he was announcing the debut of the Think Different campaign. And that's where this quote comes from. And I really love this because what he talks about is it's a very noisy world, and we're not going to get the chance to for people to remember much about us. So we have to be very clear on what we want them to know about us. And the second piece is he finishes up by saying marketing is about values. And I don't hear this very often when people start talking about innovation, but I think you have to ask yourself, why do people buy things? Right? And it's how do you connect with your consumers? How do you connect with your audience? And it's the message that you're sending, or it's the message that is affiliated with your brand and or your product that is going to, if you go back to the law of diffusion of innovation, that's going to essentially help past that 16% tipping point. The second video I watch is Simon Sinek. It's called How Great Leaders Inspire Action. And I've watched these so many times that it seems like Simon essentially took the Steve Jobs video, or many aspects of this, and essentially codified it. And if you haven't seen this, I suggest you watch it. But essentially what he's saying is that every organization in the world can tell you what they do. Most organizations can tell you how they do it, but very, very few can tell you why. And if you go to the next slide, please, it's summed up by people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And I think this is a huge factor or element that's overlooked in innovation circles, because everyone's thinking about features and functions, bits and bytes, speeds, right? There's a car commercial, it's one of my recent favorites, where it shows a young person who has just been in a car accident, and the person's there and they're on the phone, presumably to a parent, and they said, "I'm so sorry this happened, but I'm okay. I'm fine." And then it cuts over to another person in the same situation, and it's like, I'm sorry, I'm fine. And then at the very end of this commercial, the name of the manufacturer goes across the screen. But I'm not even kidding, my wife who was sitting next to me was like, "Oh, we're definitely buying that car." Right? Before you even knew what the car was, before you even knew it was a car commercial. Because the consumer is emotionally connected to this experience, and what you're taking away from this is the fact that this vehicle has just saved the life of a very thankful child, right? And there are numerous other examples. So whether you're looking at Tom's, for example, for every pair of shoes that you buy, they're going to donate a pair of shoes. If you emotionally connect with that brand, if you emotionally connect with that product, and I think that when people start looking through the innovation lens, they lose sight of this. They aren't concerned with the message that they're sending, because once again, innovation is about experiences. And a large portion of the experience is the message that you're conveying. So, the last piece of this is design thinking. So, I'm a huge fan of design thinking, right? I think it's a very effective methodology in most cases. And the reason that I say that, well, the reason I like design thinking is that it's not problem focused. And it allows you to go into an environment and you're able to empathize with end users. You are observing the current environment, you're making observations, and then you are brainstorming in terms of how you might be able to come up with, let's say, a future solution. Now, before we go to the next slide, there's another video that I kind of watch incessantly, and it's Guy Kawasaki. And he talks about innovation, and in this example, he talks about how people used to harvest ice from the Great Lakes 100 plus years ago, right? So if you were to apply design thinking to the ice harvesting process, it might look something like this. It's like, well, we're on Lake Michigan, and from December through the end of February, we've got a bunch of people up here in horses and sleds, and we cut ice out of the water and we haul it away. So let's apply design thinking to this and see what happens. And people would look at it and make observations, say, you know what we need? We need sharper saws. We need bigger carts. And we need stronger horses, right? Meanwhile, back in Tucson, Arizona, there's a person in the basement of a lab who's just learned to freeze ice in their basement, right? No one's paying attention to the person who's actually just frozen water into ice. What they're more concerned with is, how do I get the saws sharper, and how do I get bigger, stronger horses to haul more ice out of the lake? So the suggested improvement is to incorporate aspects of what we were calling technology scouting and digital ethnography to this process. And the reason being is, if you come to, let's say, a design thinking session with observations or actually data that you've collected in terms of human behavior and where you believe the market is going. So getting back to our example, if people don't have to go anywhere they don't want to, what sort of experiences should we create for them, whether it's out of store or in store, to essentially attract them or to attract their business. And then you could actually go into that process and you could start to envision experiences, right? So here's where the scouting comes in. Now, all of that capability that you've been storing in your arsenal is now useful. So it's like, we want to be able to create an experience that does the 3 or 4 following things. You know what? I think VR would be perfect for this. I think if we could create a virtual environment for people to interact and engage and have this content, this would be fantastic. So what you've essentially done at this point is, instead of just looking at the world as it exists today, you're envisioning a sort of future world, future experiences, and you are merging this with the intelligence that you've collected regarding capability through emerging technology. And these perspectives are going to change on a daily basis. But I assure you, it's much more effective than, once again, locking people in a room and having them come up with a use case. So in summary, throughout the entire conversation that we've had today, is that I think if you have the realization that technology is changing at an unprecedented rate, and you have to make the investment in understanding what that landscape is, right? And when I say an investment, it's not just an awareness, I mean an investment, right? That it's someone's responsibility or a team's responsibility to be aware of what's going on in the world and to have real conversations with real people who are actually doing this work, so that it's not an academic or an abstract concept, right? Get out of the building, hands-on what it is you're examining. The second piece of this is start to make observations with respect to how this technology or how human behavior is changing, right? And there's so much research out there that's being done. It's just starting to pull some of these different pieces in to make observations. So whether it's like everyone wants to target millennials or Gen Z, well, I would ask you, what do you know about them? Right? Do you know that the first generation to be born online? Do you know that there's something called the Instagram effect? All these different pieces. So don't try to target a population if you don't know anything about them. Do your research, and then it's, as you're coming up with your different experiences, how does your why, how does your brand message, what are you trying to convey through this experience, and how is that going to be received? Taking these 3 factors into consideration and then sort of throwing them into the design thinking methodology, then, in my opinion, leads to the creation of innovative experiences. But I think it's what we've gone through over the past few minutes is it's a very different way of looking at this in terms of like not looking through the conventional lens, right? And just being able to take the shiny new toy, trying to find a use case, but really using applied research to sort of pull all these different elements together with the realization that you might be wrong, right? But then again, you might be right. And like any research, you just take what's wrong and you sort of take that off to the side and note it, take the best bits and move forward. So with that.